Hello and welcome. I'm Anand Naidu filling in for Riz Khan. President Barack Obama came to the White House on a wave of popular discontent with the way the country was being run. His election cry, "Change we can believe in," inspired millions of Americans to head to the polls. Now, after 2 years in power, much of that initial optimism and euphoria has dissipated. America remains largely an unequal society, socially, economically and racially. The rich have got richer and the number of poor has steadily climbed. The country remains at war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Joining me to discuss these issues is a man described as one of America's most provocative intellectuals, Cornel West. Dr. West has been challenging injustice since he was a young boy. He was expelled from his third grade class when he refused to recite the Pledge of Allegiance after witnessing his uncle being lynched and wrapped in the American flag. He joins us from Princeton, where he teaches religion and African American studies. His recent memoir, Brother West, Living and Loving Out Loud, candidly shares his life experiences and perspectives. A reminder, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can also send us an SMS or email to the show. Dr. West, welcome to the show. Let me start by asking you for your assessment of President Barack Obama, just a little over 2 years that he's been in the White House.
Well, let me first say thank you very much for having me on the show, and let me second say that I look at America, I look at the Middle East, I look at Asia, I look at Africa, I look at any part of the world through the lens of suffering and struggling poor and working people. That I'm fundamentally concerned about how the prisoners are being treated, how the orphans, the widows, the fatherless, the motherless, the working classes, the poor, the sub-proletarian peoples are being treated. Are they being treated with dignity? When you look at what has happened in the American empire and in the noble democratic experiment called the USA. When you think of USA, you have to think of both democratic experiment and imperial power simultaneously. It's very clear that poor and working people had their expectations elevated with the magnificent democratic rhetoric of the campaign of President Barack Obama. But they have been deeply disappointed because when it comes to policies, it's very clear that the Obama administration tends to side much more with the rich and wealthy and corporate and oligarchic plutocratic elite than it does with poor people, than it does with working people. You look at the prison industrial complex especially, in which there's 2.5 million people incarcerated in the United States, and over 70% of black and brown poor people, and white brothers and sisters who are poor make up the rest. That there's been no serious attention, no mention of the prison industrial complex. Same is true with jobs. There's been depression-like jobs in poor communities, 30–40% rates. No serious talk of a job bill targeting poor people or working people, but of course, very, very tender and gentle treatment of investment bankers when they go under the corporate welfare, the kind of corporate socialism that has characterized the United States in the last 45 years, including the Obama administration. So let me just say this, I am profoundly disappointed in the Obama administration. I never expected them to be some source of salvation, but I did hope that they would tilt policies toward poor and working people, and they have yet to do that.
But you did campaign on his behalf when he was candidate, Barack Obama, running for the White House. Do you regret that?
Oh, no, not at all. I did 65 events from Iowa to Ohio. I did it because we needed to bring the age of Reagan to a close. By age of Reagan, I mean from 1980 to 2008, you had wealth running amok, especially at the top, increasing wealth inequality, stagnating wages for workers, vicious attacks on trade unions, and zones of abandonment, killing fields, hoods of suffering in poor communities that were generating unbelievable levels of social misery. We needed to bring that era to a close. The choice was between John McCain and Sarah Palin. That would have been a catastrophic response to our catastrophic situation. I thought Barack Obama would allow us to shift from the greed to serious talk about fairness, from the indifference to poor people and working people to serious talk about compassion, and from the politics of fear, dividing American people to politics of hope. That's what he talked about. I told him from the very beginning I would be a critical, a Socratic, a prophetic critic of the Obama administration, and that's exactly what I'm doing now. I just thought that he would have more fight, more backbone, more spine in fighting for poor and working people, but I was wrong about that. It's fairly clear that he's a centrist, that he's very much an extension of Wall Street oligarchs and corporate elites, and that working and poor people are secondary and tertiary.
Well, let me quote something that he said about the United States, and this was shortly after he was elected president. He said that nowhere else in the world would his story be possible except in the United States.
Yeah, that's a lie. It's just not true. It's not true. We've had President Lula of Brazil, who dropped out of school at 5th grade, who became president of one of the major nations in the world. If someone dropped out of the 5th grade in the United States, you can rest be assured they would never be president. Why? Because the most powerful interests in America, for the most part, would not choose someone who dropped out in the 5th grade. So all this talk about America being the only place where this unbelievable possibility is realized and actualized is just not true. It's a lie. That there's a variety of other major nations where various persons who come from marginalized contexts would be president. Same is true for women, of course. Israel's had a president, Pakistan, India has had women presidents, and so forth and so on. But yet we've yet to have one. So I mean, this notion that somehow that America has a monopoly on magical possibility is just one of the myths that we like to tell ourselves, and we have to be honest about it. I'm committed to unarmed truth. And the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. It could be in the West Bank, it could be in working poor of Tel Aviv, it could be in Pakistan, it could be in China, it can be in Guatemala, but also unapologetic love, because I speak as a Christian, and for me, every flag is subordinate to the cross, and I understand that cross as truth, allowing suffering to speak. Unapologetic love and justice is what love looks like in practice, just like deep democracy is what justice looks like when it is enacted.
Okay, I want to move to the Middle East right now and the events that are taking place right there and the sweeping calls for change across the region. There's a tweet that you sent out not so long ago, and you said if Libya had artichokes rather than oil, the US would have a very different relationship with Gaddafi. Isn't that perhaps a bit of a cynical look at the manner in which the United States behaves? After all, there were civilians who were being threatened here in Libya, and the United States led that effort to safeguard those civilians.
Well, I think one can never downplay the role of oil when it comes to U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East as a whole, not just Libya. Now, I don't think oil is the sole factor, but certainly it is a major factor. Now, we have to raise questions, though. One would be, for example, that 2.5 years ago, we had precious Palestinians who were being massacred by the hundreds. Barack Obama didn't say a mumbling word. Many of us were trying to raise our voices, put pressure on him to at least say something to stop the massacre. No serious moral compassion there. Now he makes the claim about he's got moral compassion for these civilians being massacred. Yes, I have the same moral compassion for the civilians being massacred, but not a mumbling word about other civilians being massacred. So I'm looking for moral consistency here. In addition, we also know, of course, that Gaddafi's been running things for a while. We know the United States has long policies of intimate relations with dictatorial figures, be they in Saudi Arabia, be they in the past with Marcos in the Philippines, or Noriega in Panama. We can go on and on, Mobutu, going on and on. So that for a good while, people have been suffering immensely in Libya, and the United States hardly did anything when we had intimate relations with Gaddafi. All of a sudden now we come to their defense, and we're supposed to somehow believe that this moral compassion is deep and genuine. That's what I'm critical of, but it's not cynical, my dear brother, not at all. I'm not a cynic at all. I try to tell the truth, and sometimes the truth reveals hypocrisy and mendacity, and to expose lies and hypocrisy and mendacity is not cynical, because I do have a hope. I have a hope that if we take seriously the democratic lessons, I must say, Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain, Syria, for me, it is sublime to see everyday people who have been suffering straighten their backs up, organize, mobilize, and topple tyrants. Some of those tyrants U.S. backed, some of those tyrants may not. Any tyrant who is toppled, for me, is a sublime moment. Now, I recognize the challenge because chaos can pursue, but anytime a tyrant is toppled, is toppled. I do believe, in fact, that there's democratic possibilities. So I think that we learned democratic lessons from North Africa in the Middle East. We learned them in the early 90s with Nelson Mandela and the others. Do you think that the U.S. government would ever support the ANC and Mandela in jail, then viewed as a terrorist, drop bombs on the vicious apartheid regime in order to support those folks struggling? Never in a million years. But all of a sudden now we're supposed to believe that the U.S. government has this deep moral compassion for the civilians? That's hard to believe. But at the same time, I understand how complicated it is. And I understand also that we just have to have some candor and some frankness when it comes to these complex decisions to be made by those who run empires, namely the American empire from the Oval Office.
I want to come now to an email that we received, and it addresses some of the things that you've been talking about. This is from the Afghan Journalists Association, writing to us from Afghanistan. And here's the email. They ask, how are Obama's policies towards the Muslim world any different than those of George Bush? Is he doing what really needs to be done to repair relations in the region?
Well, I appreciate the question. Certainly when it comes to tone of language and when it comes to tone of rhetoric, it's very different because Barack Obama has a sensitivity in his language to the diversity of the Muslim world, and he accents that in a way in which Bush did not. So that when he talks about learning from the Muslim world, when he talks about acknowledging the rich democratic possibilities that the Muslim world can teach the world, then I do think that's a shift in language. And when it comes to policies, I don't see the kind of discontinuity I would like to see. I see too many continuities. And so what you actually have is someone who uses a democratic rhetoric, which at times is sterling, but the same technocratic policies rooted in geopolitical interests and corporate interests remain at the center. And this is part of the problem for us in the United States, that we heard the democratic rhetoric, we heard the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. being acknowledged, and yet when we looked at his economic team, they came straight out of the Wall Street oligarchic playbook. When we looked at his foreign policy team, they were recycled Clintonites who come straight out of the neo-realist playbook, so that there's no fundamental shift in priorities in regard to policies, even as the tone has shifted in language.
Well, let's talk about that shift in policies that you're talking about. We live in an age right now of fiscal austerity. We're hearing about spending cuts at federal level, at state level. Now, you have said that corporate America has seen a need to manufacture this fiscal austerity. Spending is being cut, as I've just mentioned. Yet at the same time, we're seeing that corporate profits are soaring. What's the disconnect here?
Well, I would never claim that corporate America manufactured, because corporate America is mighty, but it's not almighty. Corporate America ensures that the priorities tilt in their direction. And by corporate America, we're also talking about oligarchic America, because as you know, the financial sector, 41% of the corporate profits in America these days, so you're talking very much about Wall Street in this regard. But the problem is there's a bipartisan agreement when it comes to the military-industrial complex, so that neither party, Democratic or Republican Party, both parties deeply colonized and dominated by corporate and oligarchic interests, don't allow for serious examination of substantial cuts in the military-industrial complex. So the debate about budgetary deficit is confined mainly to social programs, mainly to those programs that affect everyday people. So already corporate America has won, oligarchic America has won, plutocratic America has won in that regard. There's also a bipartisan agreement on the prison industrial complex, which becomes more and more a place to house significant slices of poor people, house significant slices of working people, so that you don't get a chance to talk about the $300 billion Marshall Plan spent on jails and prisons and the criminal justice system in the last 25 years. But it's a Marshall Plan not for jobs, not for education, not for employment, not for housing, but for jails and for prisons and for the criminal justice system, which becomes a kind of pro-employment program, because the third largest employer in the United States is those who are employed by the criminal justice system. You got Manpower, Inc. and Walmart, 1, 2, third, the criminal justice system. Disproportionately poor, disproportionately working class, disproportionately black and brown.
So how do ordinary people fight back? How do you roll back this kind of corporate domination that you've been talking about?
Well, one, of course, you learn from Cairo, Egypt. You learn from Madison, Wisconsin, from Indianapolis, Indiana, from Columbus, Ohio. You finally reach the point where you raise your voice, you allow those voices to come together, you organize and mobilize and say, we are tired of the Wall Street oligarchs and the corporate elites having such a disproportionate amount of influence and power, and the only way we can deal with organized greed at the top is organized people power below. And that organized people power below has been in some ways channeled into Obama campaign, Obama symbolic, cosmetic, cathartic expression, rather than serious concern with trade unions who need to be defended, teachers unions that need to be defended, policies in which poor people are able to gain access to education, quality housing, quality jobs. We're at the very, very beginning. We in the United States, we are learning from our brothers and sisters in North Africa and the Middle East some very deep democratic lessons about courage, about vision, about organizing, mobilizing, service, and sacrifice.
Okay, here's another email that we received. This one's from Barik Al-Bakai. He writes from New Jersey here in the United States. And he wants to know, what can President Obama do to regain the popular enthusiasm he had at the time of his inauguration?
I think people would rather see sermons than hear sermons. He's got to, by example, show that he is a fighter for poor and working people. But the problem is very much like the healthcare debate, where it was very clear that they met with the pharmaceutical and the private insurance companies. They made a deal, so it ends up a major giveaway for profits for both pharmaceutical and private insurance companies, and at the same time does extend, no doubt, coverage, but is still a market-driven project, and therefore it still will backfire. 20 million or more will still not have access to it, but it's not going to be able to satisfy the needs. What it was clear he did not fight. As they say on the street, he punts on the first down rather than the fourth down. He doesn't have the kind of spine and backbone like Lincoln, like FDR, like LBJ, to fight for these policies having to do with, it could be a public option, it could even be single payer, at the level of trying to convince the American people why these policies are the best for the nation by focusing on poor and working people. He doesn't have that kind of fighting temperament, it seems. And it's very sad that that's the case, because we find ourselves sinking deeper and deeper in a hole when you look at these levels of unemployment and underemployment. No serious talk about jobs. As you know, the last State of the Union, there was no reference to poor people or poverty. The first time a State of the Union was even ever presented or written since 1948 with no reference to poor people. How could that be when he's got Martin Luther King Jr.'s bus staring at him every morning saying, I died resisting American imperialism in Vietnam because I love Vietnamese babies and peoples as well as Americans. I died because I was trying to organize poor people, sanitation workers in Memphis. I died facing a vicious white supremacist Jim Crow system where the government itself was following me every day and knew I would be shot. That's the Martin Luther King Jr. who's staring every day in the Oval Office and saying, get out of that golden cage, get out of that sunlit prison, connect with the working people and poor people out there. Why are you so much in the pocket of the Wall Street oligarchs and the corporate plutocrats? Don't use my legacy in this way. Don't abuse my legacy in this way.
But if you look at the manner in which he has been ruling from the White House, he's a president who loves bipartisanship. He likes consensus. He's always reaching across the aisle. Is that perhaps his downfall?
Well, I think part of the problem is, you see, you can't have bipartisanship if you don't have partisanship as a way into it. Part of the problem with Barack Obama is that he tends to govern as a technocrat and a manager, so that he's not even partisan long enough to know what bipartisanship is, whether Republicans Republicans are deeply partisan, and when they finally reach a point, a moment where they want to be bipartisan, their partisanship is very clear, but there has to be partisanship for the bipartisanship to actually take place. But if you're a technocrat, if you're a manager, people don't know exactly what you fundamentally believe. What do you stand for? What are your principles? What is the moral content of your policies? And then you move to compromise. But if you're punting on the first down, then it's not even bipartisanship. You are deferring to those who are partisan, and that's one of the reasons why Barack Obama ends up always offering an olive branch to the Republicans, but when it comes to progressives, what do they call? Effing retards, professional leftists who don't know what they're talking about, who don't defer to what we have to say. No, we are profoundly partisan on behalf of poor and working people, and we're willing to do what it takes within the democratic process to make sure that their suffering is highlighted, be they prisoners, be they orphans, be they the elderly, be they working people, and so forth. That's what leads toward bipartisan, because you then have a compromise. Lincoln was deeply partisan, but he ended up bipartisan compromise. FDR was deeply partisan, he ended up with a bipartisan compromise. But Barack Obama is what? He is Clintonite, opportunist to the core, will do what it takes in order to keep things peaceful and for him to be reelected. That is a profound disappointment, and it in many ways is a fundamental violation of the great legacy of Martin King and Fannie Lou Hamer, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and Dorothy Day, and others who were fundamentally committed to poor and working people in the United States. We're not even talking about when it comes to the Middle East. We're not even talking about how we talk seriously about connecting the security of Israel with justice for Palestinians, and be honest about it and saying, yes, our Jewish brothers and sisters are precious, they need security, but our Palestinian brothers and sisters are just as precious and they need justice, and we've got to talk about security for one, justice for the other simultaneously, and somehow break from the very narrow and truncated policies that has characterized the U.S. government, disproportionately shaped by truncated visions of those here in the United States who downplay the fact that a Palestinian life has exactly the same value as a Jewish Israeli life, and a Jewish Israeli life has exactly the same value as a Palestinian life. And if you don't believe that, you're tribalist and nationalist, and you're contributing to the problem.
I want to get back to something personal right now. Touching back on your experience as a young man, you experienced racism, many incidents that I've seen here, witnessing horrific incidents like the one that we talked about right at the outset of the show when your uncle was lynched. But yet you've been able to retain some compassion. You've been able to look at all this with a lot of compassion. How have you managed to do that?
Well, I think it has to do with the tradition that produced me. So I'm a blues man in the life of the mind, a jazz man in the world of ideas. The jazz man and the blues man does what? Looks catastrophe in the face and resists with compassion, with sensitivity, understands the difference between justice and revenge, refuses to drink from the bitter cup of bitterness, but has a moral outrage or righteous indignation, a holy anger against injustice across the board. That's why the Black Freedom Movement has never been a movement solely concerned about black people. It's been concerned about truth, concerned about justice, concerned about love, concerned about fairness, and concerned about the operations of power. One of the problems these days in America, anytime people think of black people in the Black Freedom Movement, you think it's just a special interest group like the corporations that function as special interest groups. But no, the Black Freedom Movement, from Frederick Douglass to Ida B. Wells Barnett to Martin King, has always talked about poor people here and around the world, working people here and around the world. It begins on the chocolate side. It begins with black folk, no doubt, because we've been terrorized for 350 years with slavery and Jim Crow. We were traumatized. We were stigmatized. But our response to that terror, our response to that trauma, our response to that stigma was what? We want to tell the truth about the country, and we want to bear witness to justice. And justice includes compassion, not just to black people, but to other people. We never lose sight of the humanity of other people, even as we are gangsterized and dehumanized by others. That's the greatness, that's the gift of black people to the world. In the face of terror, we don't opt for an Al-Qaeda, we produce Martin Luther King Jr. He's still murdered, but we don't opt for murdering other innocent people. But at the same time, we do have a righteous indignation that says that even if we have to die, we're going to die with the truth, we're going to die with integrity, we're going to die with dignity, because we can't stand the hypocrisy of the American empire, of dictators, or anybody else who overlooks the humanity of poor and working people.
Okay, Dr. West, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us. And thanks for being with us. A reminder, you can follow our program on Twitter. We'll keep you notified on upcoming shows, and you can send us questions and comments to pose to our guests. On the next show, as coalition forces continue to help rebels in Libya, the West remains silent on Bahrain, Yemen, and Syria. Is a Western double standard emerging? That's coming up next. Make sure you tune in for that. We'll see you next time.